In October, the BBC board issued a statement on the Israel-Gaza war that referred to a review of the editorial guidelines that was planned to take place in the spring. Has that taken place?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if David can give us a detail on where we are in terms of standards.
So the reference was to a particular part of the review of the editorial guidelines. There are people in this room who know quite a lot about reviews of editorial guidelines, but just for the benefit of others, we do this every 4 or 5 years. We have a look at the editorial guidelines and whether they're fit for the purpose currently. We review them in terms of changes in the law, changes in the Ofcom code, changes in audience expectations, all of those kinds of things. And we go through a process each time, which starts with me and with my team looking at all of the feedback we've had over the previous 4 to 5 years in relation to implementing the guidelines. We then update them in relation to that. And after we've been through that process and consulted our lawyers and similarly and people in-house, we then go to a more general consultation with everybody in the BBC. And we're at that point at the moment. When we've finished doing that, which will be, we want those comments in by the end of this month. It will take us a little while to build them into the latest draft. When we've got the latest draft of that, we'll then take that to a public consultation, which will happen in this spring, which will last for 6 weeks and give an opportunity to everybody. And we don't just do that reactively. We don't just, as it were, put it on our website and ask people to comment. We proactively send the draft to a lot of stakeholder organisations and indeed to political parties and others and ask them positively for comment. When we finished all that process, we obviously take that into account and we then take that draft back to the board, which ultimately signs this off. Hopefully we'll do that in the first part of the autumn. And when they've agreed to it, we then go on to publish hopefully before we get to the next general election, but you'll know more about whether that's likely than I do. So we have a process, and the bit that you're referring to was the public consultation, which is coming up next.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. So, Mr Davey, back to my original question. The Secretary of State said there is a perception amongst the public that the BBC is biased. Was she being unfair?
Well, she was sharing a personal perspective, and I get a lot of personal perspective. What I look at is the date. When we look at the overall data on the BBC, the perception of impartiality remains strong, but on either side of a strong score, you've also got people who view us to go one way or the other, and we continue to work on that.
Yeah, I want to come in on the back of the Israel-Gaza coverage because the ICJ hearing several weeks ago was a hugely significant news item. The channel that has replaced the news channel, there was hardly any of the South African submission on day one, and yet hours and hours of the Israeli submission on day two. Have you looked into the disaster that was in terms of impartiality, because it wasn't impartial?
We've had lots of, as you know, I get feedback of significant feedback from people on either side, if we can simplify it even as either side on this in this.
I don't think there's two sides to this. I think there's an issue of impartiality.
I mean,
and
David may look at it, but we did cover in detail that ruling.
And I watched it, all of it.
And but I'm just talking on one outlet in terms of we can debate the ins and outs of that. But overall, I think we've been pretty robust in covering the ICJ proceedings.
So you think it was fair to have a tiny bit of the South African submission and then switch to the post office, which again is a very, very important story.
I think
I'm not decrying that.
Overall,
but then have hours and hours the next day of the other side's submission. You think that was fair and impartial?
Well, I think on a rolling news channel, you've got in terms of selections, in terms of what's going.
Do you think that was fair and impartial?
I think
balanced?
I think overall, when you look at our coverage on the rulings, we've been in a reasonable position.
David, do you think it was fair and impartial? The coverage of those 2 days of hearings I'm talking about, not the rest of the news.
I think you've put your finger on something very important about what happened, because it only happened on our UK output. The international output covered the two sides of that conflict and of the presentations that were made to the ICJ. They covered them equally in our international coverage. In our UK coverage, because the hearing on the post office was being held at the same time, they made the editorial decision to go with the post office coverage rather than the other coverage, which, as you can tell, was a very difficult decision to make.
Do you think
when news looked at it in retrospect, they did think that perhaps they'd made a mistake in not making the two live coverage events similar or the same. But they did make all the other coverage was very similar and the same and was very, very comprehensive. So it was just about the live coverage on the news channel on those 2 days, which wasn't absolutely equivalent. And in this particular conflict, if you don't have absolute equivalence, as you know, it leads to people suspecting that you're doing something deliberately to be biased. That isn't the case. It was genuinely a difficult editorial decision about which hearing they went with.
You think that was a mistake to do the coverage?
News have said that if they thought about it again, they might have done it differently.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Damien.
Thank you, Chair.